And I think that one of the most important things, therefore, to consider is when we're actually dealing with our sites, urban design has almost got this sort of common good element to it, almost this sort of socialist aspect to it, that it's not about taking as much as possible from the context for our site and thinking, what can we get from the site and maximise that? It's thinking, and this is how urban designers think, particularly on these urban design panels and asking for urban design assessments. It's what is the site actually putting back to the context? What is the site actually giving back to the local area and the neighbourhood? And that doesn't mean to say that the developer's going to have to take a hit if you're acting for a developer, because obviously if you're improving your context, if you're improving your local neighbourhood and your area, then that's obviously going to come back and benefit the site itself. So I think this is a fundamental tenet to urban design. So what's stopping us? Well, our planning process, I think, is one of the biggest barriers, and we probably all know this. So apologies if I'm telling you stuff that you already know. But our planning process, I find absolutely bizarre. Coming from a planning background, we've got examples, things like the Pack and Save out at Wairo Park in Auckland. Whether you agree whether a Pack and Save should have gone there or not, the fact that it took 20 years to resolve something isn't quite right with our system there. And the fact that the way that we've interpreted the RMA, our district planning process, as I say, I'm a planner, and I still couldn't explain to you, and you're not supposed to read this, but this is sort of a summary of how the district plan in Auckland works. And it's just impossible to explain to somebody within a few short minutes as to how our planning system works. It's so complicated, and that's coming from a planning background. And I don't think it needs to be like that at all. This is my version of the New Zealand planning system. Probably slightly naive, but I think it could be so simple that the problem that we're faced with in New Zealand is all these different types of planning consent: discretionary, limited discretionary, restricted discretionary, restricted, limited discretionary, and all those sorts of things. And the fact that if you go down one route, it's fine, but if you go down a different route and suddenly you're required to be notified, then man, that's all sorts of problems. So we try and avoid that like the plague. But what it means is that you're having to conform to a set of rules that are about rules. And we know that design isn't about rules. You can't design by numbers. And so the creativity and the innovation is taken out, and that we have a system that's rewarded on simplicity rather than actual creativity. So why don't we just have one type of planning consent? You either need planning consent or you don't. You submit it to the council carries out consultation on your behalf. You don't have to go right into neighbours and get in signatories and that sort of stuff. And the council just simply make a decision based upon any rules and policies that are in place, a result of consultation and current best practice. The problem we've got at the moment is that it either conforms to the rules or it doesn't. And what we should be able to do is assess it against the rules, and obviously that's reported to the decision-making authority. If it complies with the rules, completely fine, but if it doesn't, then you've got the opportunity to explain why you think your scheme is still good enough, even though it doesn't meet the rules. And then you just have one chance of appeal with an inspector, and I think this is where the UK system works particularly well. We have the planning inspectorate made up of inspectors who are absolute experts in their field, generally 20, 30 years experience behind them, and there is a great deal of consistency in the UK appeals process, partly because there's the risk of paying costs if you take an appeal that is just completely erroneous decision. If the council makes an erroneous decision, then obviously the council has to be aware that it can end up paying costs. So you generally find that there's a pretty good decision-making process worried about those costs in the UK, and you get good decisions by an inspector, and that's it. And from start to finish, there's no reason why that can't take 12 months. So that's my simple New Zealand planning system. I don't see why we can't just have that in next week. We'll vote on that one. It's not that simple, is it? Of course. So our planning process, lack of political interest involvement. Well, perhaps political interest is wrong, but we have a number of ministers in the country on all those subjects. And again, it's like going back to the analogy of making a car. Where's the minister for planning or for places or for urban places? We've got an environment minister, but it's largely responsible for the natural environment. And all these ministers are generally different people. There's maybe one or two there that have 2 or 3 of those portfolios. But generally we've got all these different things, and yet we've just described that a place consists of all these different elements. Who's making the decisions on the quality of place? I think that's one of the difficulties that we're faced with. We're producing some good documents now within New Zealand, but I still think that one of the things that we're lacking is a general consensus on this issue. These documents are few and far between, and as I say, the government, central government, are fairly quiet on these issues. And local authorities in particular are largely left to themselves. So we've got 75 different local authorities in the country. It's like being in 75 different countries, with each one of the local authorities having to fight its own battles against some really big players. And you've got different regulations at one end of the street as you might have at another end of the street. And I mentioned this to a senior politician last year in the Prime Minister's office, and saying that, in the UK what happens again is central government does the policy, fights all the big battles because it's got lots of resources, and then it's just rolled out across the country, expecting him to go, yeah, I know, I've heard it all before. And he was like, really, is that what happens? Oh, that sounds like a great idea. And I can't believe we're not thinking of that. So lots of good documents emerging, but one of the another advantage in the UK is CABE, I'm sure you're all familiar with. And one of the great things about CABE is that it's consistent regardless of the government that's in charge. They've been given a mandate. It's largely non-political. It's about quality of place and just their ability to communicate what is good design and reach a consensus amongst the professions particularly, but also they're doing some great work amongst residents, the people who actually use our places, and achieving a great deal of consensus as a result of that. And they're just constantly producing documents, probably producing too many documents, but I would urge you, if you're not particularly familiar with some of CABE's stuff, go and have a look. And I know Geoffrey's going to talk a little bit more about it as well, I think, so sorry if I've usurped you there. And we do a lot of talking, that's for sure. We do a lot of report writings. Part of my job at Auckland City was just to do some research on what's been written about the direction of Auckland. This was before the Royal Commission. I couldn't believe how much had been written, and loads of it, fantastic stuff as well, all pointing to the right things that we need to do. We're just not getting on and doing it. And I love this document that I came across in Toronto called Enough Talk, because they're obviously been faced with the same situation. So much talking, come on, we need to actually do something about it now. So going back to my list of the barriers that are stopping us, how am I doing on time? Okay. Our culture, and I think Patrick touched on this in his introduction, and we've got this, perhaps I'm being a little bit sensitive when I talk about this, as a fairly recent as arrival, but we do consider our landscape to be sacred, and the city profane. And Paul Moraine, who many of you might know, who visited New Zealand, he's visited a couple of times, came up with this great phrase: we can't continue to believe that the landscape is sacred and the city profane. They must be both be considered sacred. We go away on holidays and trips abroad to even as close to Australia. We go to Sydney and Melbourne and marvel at their sort of quality of city centres. And particularly we go to Europe and visit places like Paris and Barcelona. We just marvel at their urban environments. And yet we've got so much stopping us from doing those sorts of things over here. And it's interesting that I think that, the suburbs, this whole suburban way of planning, of laying out our suburbs, was a bit of a reaction to the sort of messy urban environment in the sort of 19th century, particularly early 20th century, that living in the centre of cities started to become dirty and noisy. And Ebenezer Howard, who I mentioned earlier before, came up with this grand idea of let's move out a little bit and try and get the best of both worlds. And so the suburbs were created, as I say, sort of a reaction against what was happening in the urban areas. And I think it's fair to say that New Zealand almost, I consider, is almost a suburban country in the way that it's actually, there's a reaction. A lot of people initially moved here as a reaction to some of the environments that they were found abroad, particularly in the UK. So it was almost, as New Zealand's sort of a suburb of some of the other places. And we do come across a lot of people when we're involved in developments who, when we're trying to get sort of higher density uses through, or a mix of uses through, and say, you can't take away my space, you can't take away my view, that's exactly what I came to New Zealand for. And I think it's changing, and probably the whole of this room is probably more signed up to the sort of urban way of life, but possibly not. And certainly the younger generation is certainly moving towards wanting, where I worked at Auckland City, we found a number of people who'd moved to Auckland in their sort of 20s, expecting to be able to buy a place or to rent a place where they didn't need a car, and just be extremely disappointed that they can't find anywhere where you can live really without a car, even in Auckland. So I think the younger generation are starting to get this a bit more, but certainly we're faced with a culture, an ingrained culture that is actually deeply suburban, I think. I'm sorry if that offends anybody.